The day Della Blackwell buried her husband, the sky above Harrow Creek, Texas turned the color of a bruise, and she stood at the edge of the fresh mound of earth with nothing in her pockets, nothing in her pantry, and nothing left to call her own except a name she wasn't even sure she wanted to keep. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Western Territories were unforgiving to women alone. Harrow Creek sat at the edge of a long stretch of hardpan dust and mesquite country, a town that existed because of the cattle trail that ran through it, and for no other reason that Della could see. The saloon stayed open longer than the church. The sheriff spent most of his evenings at a card table, and the women who had no men attached to them were treated with a particular brand of practiced indifference that amounted to something just short of cruelty. Della was 27 years old, and she had come to Harrow Creek 6 years earlier as the young bride of Thomas Blackwell, a man who had promised her the sky and delivered her a 2-room house on the scrubby edge of town with a leaking roof and a temperamental well. Thomas had not been a bad man. He had been a weak one, which Della had come to understand was sometimes worse. He drank. Not viciously, but steadily, the way a river erodes a bank slowly, and then all at once. By the time a riding accident out on the South Range had taken him in early October, there was more debt attached to the Blackwell property than there was equity in it. The bank note came 3 weeks after the funeral. Mr. Aldous Greer, who ran the Harrow Creek savings and lending with the warmth of a January well, sent his clerk to deliver it personally. Della owed $42.70 on the remaining mortgage balance, and she had until the 1st of December to produce it or vacate the premises. She stood on her porch and read that note 4 times while the wind moved through the dead brown grass of her yard, and when she had finished reading it the 4th time, she folded it precisely in half, tucked it into the pocket of her black morning dress, and went inside to figure out what she could sell. There was not much: a rocking chair that had belonged to Thomas's mother, 2 good iron pots, a small collection of her own books that she had carried from Missouri in a flour sack when she was 21 and hopeful. She sold all of it over the course of the following week, driving a small wagon into town and setting up at the edge of the market square with the quiet, unflinching dignity of a woman who refused to be seen breaking apart. She raised $11.50, nowhere near enough. She tried washing clothes for the women whose husbands ran the more prosperous businesses in town: Mrs. Greeley at the dry goods store, Mrs. Fitch, whose husband owned the livery, Mrs. Aldous Greer herself, which Della found particularly galling, scrubbing the undergarments of the wife of the man who was going to put her out in the cold. But even working her hands raw from sunup to past dark every day, she was barely keeping herself fed, let alone making progress on the debt. November came in hard and cold, and Della was standing at her fence line one evening watching the sun go down behind the flat edge of the world when her neighbor, old Hector Finch, shuffled over and told her there was a man at the saloon who was asking about the Blackwell property. "What kind of man?" Della asked. Hector scratched his gray beard. "Stranger. Came in on the afternoon stage. Big fellow. Quiet. Bought a single whiskey and nursed it for 2 hours while he talked to the barkeep about who owned land out this way." Della felt the smallest cold twist of something in her chest that she could not name. "He say what he wanted with it?" "No," Hector said, "but he didn't look like a land speculator. Too trail-worn for that. Looked more like a man who'd been riding a long time and was trying to figure out where to stop." She thanked Hector and went back inside, but she could not stop thinking about it. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself she should go to bed early and be up before dawn to finish the Greeley laundry. She made herself a cup of weak coffee and sat at her kitchen table in the thin lamplight and looked at the banknote that was still on the table where she had left it. And then she looked at the 4 walls of the house that she had lived in for 6 years, and she picked up her shawl and walked into town. The saloon was called the Copper Nail, which had always struck Della as a deeply unromantic name for a place where so many human dramas played out. She stood outside it in the cold dusk, watching the amber light spill under the swinging doors, listening to the low rumble of voices and the off-key piano. She had never been inside it in 6 years of living in Harrow Creek. Women of her station did not go into saloons, but she had already sold her rocking chair and scrubbed another woman's undergarments, so she pushed open the doors and walked in. The room went quiet in the way that rooms do when something unexpected enters them. Della stood straight and let them look. The barkeep, a red-faced man named Cully, blinked at her from behind the counter. The card players at the far table looked up. And at the bar, sitting alone with his single glass of whiskey, exactly as Hector had described, a man turned and looked at her. He was tall, she could see that even seated on the bar stool with broad shoulders, and the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and time rather than softness. Dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw dusted with several days' worth of beard, and eyes that were a clear and steady hazel that caught the lamplight and held it. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more, with the kind of stillness about him that Della recognized as a thing that had been earned through difficulty rather than born from ease. He wore a plain gray shirt, canvas trousers, and boots that had seen considerable road. No ornamentation, no badge. Just a man sitting quietly in a strange town saloon, watching her walk in with an expression of genuine surprise that he was doing his best to keep controlled. Della walked to the bar. She could feel every eye in the room on her back. She sat down on the stool 2 spaces from the stranger and looked at Cully. "I'll have a coffee if you have it," she said, "and I'd like to speak with this gentleman if he's willing." The stranger turned on his stool to face her more directly. Up close, she could see a small scar along his left jaw, the kind that comes from something sharp and fast rather than something prolonged. His hands on the bar were calloused and capable-looking, and he wore no ring. "Marshall Holloway," he said, and his voice was low and even, a voice that did not perform itself. "And I am willing." "Della Blackwell," she said, "I hear you were asking about my property." Something shifted in his expression, not guilt exactly, but a kind of recognition that she was a more direct person than he had expected. He picked up his whiskey glass, looked at it for a moment, then set it down without drinking from it. "I was asking about available land," he said carefully. "I didn't know whose it was." "It's mine," Della said, "for another 22 days anyway, then the bank takes it." Cully set a tin cup of coffee in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth move through her cold fingers and was grateful for it in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee itself. "I'm sorry to hear that," Marshall Holloway said, and she believed him. "Are you looking to buy land?" Della asked. "I'm looking to settle," he said. "I've been moving for a long time, too long. I have money enough to buy a modest piece of property and build something on it." He paused. "Where are you going to go after December?" It was a blunt question, but it did not feel rude coming from him. It felt like something an honest man asked when he was trying to understand a situation clearly. "I don't know," Della said, which was the first time she had said those words out loud to anyone. They felt terrible in her mouth, like biting down on something rotten. "I don't have family to go back to. I don't have money to go anywhere. I suppose I'll take in more laundry and find a room to let somewhere in town." He looked at her steadily. "How much is the debt?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment. "I could pay that debt," he said slowly. "It wouldn't make a large dent in what I have." Della set her coffee cup down very deliberately on the bar. "I am not in the habit of accepting charity from strangers, Mr. Holloway." "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering a proposition." The saloon had gone half quiet around them, men making a poor pretense of not listening. Della ignored them. "Then say what you mean plainly," she said. Marshall Holloway turned his whiskey glass once in his large hands. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might be reconsidering whatever he had been about to say. Then he looked up at her and met her eyes with an expression of such careful sincerity that it knocked something loose in her chest. "I need land and I need to build a life," he said. "You need to keep your land and you need some security. I am not an exciting man, Mrs. Blackwell. I've worked cattle and I've driven freight and I've done some scouting work and none of it has made me anything but tired. I'd like to stop moving. I'd like to have a farm. I'd like to do it with someone beside me." He took a breath. "I am proposing that we marry. I would pay your debt. Your land stays in your name. I would work the land and we'd make a go of it together. You'd be under no obligation to me beyond what you freely agreed to, and if at the end of a year you found you couldn't abide me, I'd leave without complaint." The silence after he finished speaking was the loudest thing Della had ever heard. She looked at him. The lamp above the bar threw his face into warm, uncertain light, and she could see that he was nervous in the way a man is nervous when he has said something true and irreversible, and has no idea what is going to come back at him. She had every reason to stand up and walk out. She knew nothing about this man. He could be anyone. He could be dangerous, dishonest, cruel in ways that had not shown themselves yet. She had known Thomas Blackwell for 4 months before marrying him, and that had not gone the way she hoped, and she had known Thomas at least well enough to know his name before the ceremony. But she looked at Marshall Holloway's clear hazel eyes and his calloused hands, and the way he had said the word freely with a particular emphasis that told her he understood the difference between an arrangement and a trap, and she thought about the empty pantry and the bank note and the 4 walls that were going to belong to someone else in 22 days. "I would need to know some things about you," she said, "before I could give you any kind of answer." "That's fair," he said. "Ask whatever you like." "Are you wanted by the law anywhere?" "No." "Have you been married before?" "No." "Do you drink heavily?" A slight shift in his expression, not offense but understanding. He knew what that question was really asking about. "A glass now and then," he said. "Nothing I can't put down." "Why Harrow Creek?" she asked. "Why here of all places?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was born not far from here," he said. "About 60 miles south. Left when I was 19 after my parents died of fever. I've been moving ever since. Lately I've been thinking about coming back to this part of the country. Something about it feels like the only real home I've known, even when I was poor and hungry in it." He paused. "That probably sounds foolish." "It doesn't," Della said quietly. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the bar in front of her, worn smooth by 1,000 leaning elbows. She thought of her books, which were gone now, sold for 50 cents to a woman who probably just wanted the shelf space they could fill. She thought of her house, which was cold and leaking in hers, and which would not be hers much longer. She thought of what it meant to say yes to a stranger in a saloon at dusk on a cold November evening in 1878, and she thought of what it meant to say no. She picked up her coffee and took a long sip of it. Then she set the cup down and looked at Marshall Holloway and said, "I'll give you my answer in the morning." He nodded as though that was exactly the right answer to the answer. "Where should I find you?" "I'll find you," she said. "If it's yes, I'll come here at 8 o'clock. If I'm not here by 8, then it's no, and I'd appreciate it if you went on your way without making things difficult." "Of course," he said simply. She stood up, pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and walked out of the Copper Nail with her chin up and every eye in the room watching her go. She walked home in the cold dark and stood at her fence line for a long time, looking at the flat scrubby land around her, the low silver brush of stars above, the dull distant sound of coyotes somewhere out west. She was not afraid of being alone. She had been effectively alone for the last 2 years of her marriage, alone in the deeper sense of having no one who truly saw her. Fear was not the thing. The thing was something more complicated, a tangle of pride and grief and a stubborn, furious hope that she had been trying to keep alive under increasingly difficult conditions. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She did not sleep. She thought about what she knew. He had told her his name. He had proposed marriage with terms that were more fair than most arrangements she could imagine, her land in her name, freedom if it didn't work, no coercion in his tone or his manner. He had not looked at her the way some men looked at a widow, with that particular acquisitive calculation that had nothing to do with the woman and everything to do with what she represented. He had looked at her the way a person looks at another person when they are genuinely trying to understand who they are. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the way hope could corrode over years of disappointment. She thought about whether she had it in her to try again. At some point near midnight, she got up and heated water on the stove and washed her face and hands, and looked at herself in the small cracked mirror hung by the window. Brown hair that the frontier wind had turned slightly wild, dark eyes that had seen more than they'd expected to by 27, a face that was still her own, even if she sometimes had trouble recognizing it through the fatigue. She made her decision somewhere in the small hours of the morning, and it felt less like a decision and more like a recognition of something that had already been determined. At 20 minutes past 7 the next morning, Della Blackwell put on her second-best dress, pinned her hair neatly, and walked into town. She pushed open the doors of the Copper Nail at 7:45 to find Marshall Holloway already at the bar, nursing another coffee, his hat on the stool beside him, his hands folded around the cup. He looked up when she walked in, and something moved across his face that she could only describe as relief. 8 o'clock, he said. I'm early, she said. Yes. He stood up from the bar stool, which she had not expected, and the simple courtesy of it, standing when she entered, just as naturally as breathing, undid something small and stubborn inside her. I want you to know, she said carefully, keeping her voice low so that Cully, who was pretending to wipe down the far end of the bar, could not hear her clearly, that I am not a fool, and I am not desperate enough to overlook things. If you are not who you say you are, I will find out. And if I find out after we are married, I will make the remainder of your days in Harrow Creek as uncomfortable as the Lord allows. Marshall Holloway looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He smiled. Not a cocky smile or an amused smile, but a real one, the kind that came from somewhere genuine and surprised. It changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less weathered, and something dangerously close to handsome. That seems reasonable, he said. They went to the justice of the peace that morning. His name was Judge Abner Croft, a dried-up little man who wore the same brown suit every day of his life and married couples with the enthusiasm of a man reading tax assessments. He married Della and Marshall in approximately 7 minutes, with Cully from the saloon and his wife Bess as witnesses, and it was the least ceremonial thing Della had ever been part of. And yet when Judge Croft said the words and Marshall Holloway said, "I do," in that same low, unhurried voice, she felt the weight of it land squarely in her chest. When it was over, she signed the register as Della Holloway and then paused, looking at the name, and then looked at Marshall. I'd like to keep Blackwell too, she said. Della Blackwell Holloway, if that suits you. He had barely blinked. It suits me fine, he said. After the ceremony, Marshall went to the bank and paid Aldous Greer the $42.70 in full, in cash, from a worn leather wallet that was thick with bills that had clearly been saved carefully over a long time. Greer marked the account settled with the expression of a man who had been hoping for a foreclosure and found himself denied it. They walked back to the house together through the mid-morning cold. Their first walk as a married couple, along the packed dirt road at the edge of town, not touching, a decorous distance between them, both looking straight ahead. Della noticed that he walked at her pace rather than his own, which was something she registered and filed away. When they reached the property, she pushed open the gate. It needed a new hinge. She had been meaning to fix it for months, and gestured at the house and the small barn beyond it and the flat, dry land stretching out in all directions. It's not much, she said. It's land, he said. Land can become anything with work. She showed him the house. The 2 rooms, the leaking corner in the bedroom that she had been catching in a tin bucket, the stove that pulled to the left and required a particular technique to draw properly, the well that needed priming in cold weather. He walked through it all quietly, nodding, taking stock, and she had the strange and disconcerting feeling of showing her poverty to someone and not feeling ashamed of it. I'll sleep in the barn, he said, when they had come full circle back to the front room. Della had been expecting this, had been bracing herself for it, but she had not been expecting the tactfulness with which he said it simply, without making it into a situation that required negotiation or explanation. He was giving her space without being asked for it. "There's a cot in there," she said, "and enough blankets if you fold them double. It gets cold before dawn." "I've been cold before," he said, and again that smallest ghost of a smile. That first day they worked. There was always work on a frontier property, and doing something with their hands turned out to be easier than talking. Marshall found the fence tools in the barn and spent the afternoon replacing the gate hinge and reinforcing 2 sections of the south fence that were leaning badly. Della cooked a supper from what she had, which was not much salt pork and dried beans and cornbread baked in the iron skillet, and called him in when it was ready. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and ate the humble meal with a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable but something in between, like 2 people waiting to understand the shape of the thing they had agreed to. "This is good," he said about the cornbread. "It's just cornbread," she said. "Still good," he said. After supper, he helped her clear the table without being asked, which was another thing she filed away. Then he said goodnight and went to the barn, and Della sat alone in her kitchen for a long time listening to the wind come off the plain and feeling the strange double sensation of being less alone than she had been in years, and yet still very much uncertain about the thing she had done. She had married a stranger. She had married a stranger at dusk the night before, and now it was morning, and now he was real, and she lay in her bed in the thin, cold dark and stared at the ceiling and thought, well, here we are. Over the following days, Marshall Holloway proved to be, above all things, a worker. He rose before dawn every morning. She could hear the barn door creak open in the gray dark before she even had the stove going, and by the time she had breakfast on the table, he had already fed and watered the 2 horses, checked on the small chicken flock that lived in a pen behind the barn, and assessed whatever needed assessing. He was methodical in the way of someone who had learned to find comfort in steady effort rather than in rest. He did not tell her what he was doing or ask for approval. He simply did it, and presented her with the results at the end of the day. On the second day, he told her the well casing needed reinforcing before hard winter set in and asked what tools she had. On the third day, he spent the full afternoon on the roof, patching the leak in the bedroom corner with timber and tallow, and whatever he could improvise, and that night there was no drip in the bucket. And Della stood in the bedroom and looked at the dry ceiling and felt something stir in her that she was not entirely prepared to name. On the 4th evening, it was cold enough that she made hot tea after supper, and she set a second cup out without thinking, and he came in from checking the animals and saw the cup and looked at her and said simply, "Thank you," in a tone that seemed to carry more weight than the 2 words could properly hold. They began to talk, slowly, cautiously, the way you ease yourself into cold water. She told him about her life in Missouri, where she had grown up on a farm outside a small town called Laurel, the second of 4 children, the only one who had read every book in the county lending library by the time she was 16. She told him about coming west with Thomas, about the dreams she'd had for the land and what it had become. She did not speak badly of Thomas. She simply described what had been, with the level precision of someone who had had time to arrive at the truth of a thing without bitterness about it. He listened with the particular quality of attention that she was coming to understand was simply the way he listened fully, without interrupting, without trying to shape what she was saying toward a conclusion that suited him. And then he told her things in return. He had grown up south of Harrow Creek, on a small ranch that his father had run into the ground through a combination of bad luck and poor decisions. He had watched his parents struggle and refuse help and die of a fever that might have been treatable if they'd had more money and less pride. He had left at 19 with $30 and the clothes on his back, and worked his way through a long string of difficult jobs. Cattle drives up through the territories, freight hauling, 2 seasons of scouting for a surveying crew that was mapping the edge of the Indian territories. He had seen a great deal of the country. He had liked very little of it more than he liked this particular patch of dusty Texas scrubland. "Why?" Della asked one evening. "What is it about it?" He thought about this for a moment, his coffee cup held loosely in his hands, looking at the dark square of the kitchen window. "The sky," he said finally. "Nowhere else I've been, the sky sits so low and so wide at the same time, like it's paying attention to you." She looked at him. He was not, as he had said, an exciting man in the ordinary sense of the word. He did not perform himself. He did not tell stories to make himself larger or more interesting than he was. But there was something in him that she kept encountering, a kind of depth that showed itself in small moments. In the way he had said the word freely that first evening, in the way he had stood when she walked into the room, in the way he described the sky as though it were a thinking thing. She found herself watching him, and then trying not to, and then watching him again. Hector Finch came by at the end of the first week, ostensibly to return a borrowed post-hole digger, but actually, Della understood, to assess Marshall Holloway with the thorough, if gentle suspicion of a neighbor who cared about her welfare. Marshall shook Hector's hand and answered his questions without either defensiveness or performance, and by the time Hector left an hour later, he had somehow agreed to help Marshall source timber for the project of shoring up the barn's back wall. "You did that on purpose," Della said, when Hector was gone. Marshall looked at her with the expression of a man who had no idea what she was talking about, which she found she did not entirely believe. "He was checking on you," Marshall said. "He's right, too. You should have people doing that." She did not know what to do with the warmth that moved through her at that. The second week of their marriage brought a change in routine that she had not anticipated. She had been doing the laundry work for the women in town since before Marshall arrived, and she continued it because the money, small as it was still needed. But Marshall, without comment, began quietly repairing and improving things around the property in ways that she suspected were calculated to eventually make the laundry work unnecessary. He reinforced the chicken coop and expanded it, and within 2 weeks the hens were laying at a rate that produced a steady surplus she could sell at market. He bartered 2 days of fencing work for a neighbor named Pryor in exchange for a young pig, which he installed in a corner of the barn with cheerful practicality. "Do you know how to raise hogs?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I'm a quick learner." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since before Thomas died, and it came out slightly rusty, and she covered her mouth with her hand, startled by it. Marshall looked at her over the top of the stall door with an expression of such straightforward pleasure at the sound of it that she had to look away. 2 days after the pig arrived, there was a difficulty in town that required Marshall's involvement against his preference. He had gone to Greer's Savings and Lending to ask about the terms of a possible small extension of credit for seed purchase, not for himself, he explained carefully to Della, but structured so that it was in her name, and he had come home looking as though he had bitten down on something unpleasant. "Greer won't deal with me," he said simply. "Because you paid my debt and denied him the foreclosure," Della said without surprise. She had known Aldous Greer for 6 years. "He was polite about it," Marshall said, "but yes." "Then we deal elsewhere," Della said. "There's a dry goods merchant on the next street. His name is Whitmore. He's been extending credit to small farmers for 20 years and he's honest. I'll go with you." He looked at her. "You've known this town longer than I have," he said. "I should have asked you first." It was such a simple thing to say, and yet it sat in her chest like a coal in a cold room. "Shall have asked you," not directed her or spoken over her or assumed his way was right. He acknowledged that she knew things he did not, and he said so without any fuss. They went to Whitmore together, and the merchant extended them a modest line of credit with a handshake and a reasonable rate, and as they walked out of the store into the bright cold November air, they fell into step beside each other without either of them engineering it, their shoulders nearly touching. It was Marshall who drew back slightly, to maintain the proper distance, and Della who felt the absence of that nearness in a way that puzzled and unsettled her. They were sleeping at opposite ends of the house. She had told herself this was practical and correct, and exactly the arrangement they had agreed to, and it was. But the arrangement, she was discovering, was beginning to feel different than it had when it was hypothetical. She talked to Bess about it. Bess, who was Cully's wife and had served as one of their witnesses at the wedding, was a broad, pragmatic woman of 40 who had no patience for dancing around things. "You're catching feelings for your husband," Bess said, over the kitchen table at Della's house where she had come to drop off some eggs from her own surplus. "What's the problem?" "We've been married 11 days, Della said. "I don't know him." "You know him better than you knew Thomas Blackwell at the same point," Bess said. "I remember when you came to town with him. You were starry-eyed, sure, but you were also guessing at him, filling in the parts you didn't know with your hopes. This is different. This man is showing you who he actually is." Della stared at her coffee cup. "Is he kind to you?" Bess asked. "Yes," Della said. "Does he work like a man possessed? Does he make you feel safe?" Della thought about the leaking roof that no longer leaked, the fence hinge that no longer sagged, the way he always said goodnight before he went to the barn, and the way that small ritual had become, over 11 days, a thing she looked forward to for the entire latter half of the evening. "Yes," she said. "Then I don't understand the problem," Bess said, and ate a piece of cornbread with the serene authority of a woman who had figured something out. The problem, Della understood, was that she was afraid, not of Marshall, of herself, of the part of her that had opened up to hope before and been gradually, unremarkably disappointed, of the fact that 11 days was not enough time to know anything for certain, of the fact that she had already begun to wait for the sound of the barn door in the mornings, and that the morning he might stop being there felt like something she did not want to look at directly. The cattle situation came to a head in late November. A rancher named Cole Draper, a large, red-faced man who ran the biggest operation in the county, and who had been trying to acquire the Blackwell property for 2 years before the debt came due, came by with 2 of his men on a gray Thursday afternoon. Della had seen Draper riding by before, always that slow consideration of the fence line that told her exactly what he thought he was looking at, which was land that was about to become available. He had made one offer directly to Aldous Greer, Della knew, before the debt had even been formally issued, which told her all she needed to know about the relationship between Greer and Draper. She was in the yard when the 3 riders came up the road and stopped at the gate. Marshall was on the south side of the barn, invisible from the road, doing something with the fence posts. Della walked to the gate herself and stood at it with her hands at her sides. "Mrs. Blackwell," Draper said, touching his hat brim, "hear you've had some changes out here." "Mrs. Holloway now," Della said. "And yes, my husband and I have been making improvements." Draper's eyes moved to the gate, the reinforced fence line, the newly patched section of barn roof she could see from here. He was calculating. She could see it in his face. "Didn't know you'd remarried," he said, and his tone had the particular flatness of a man who had made a plan that no longer worked. "Is there something I can do for you, Mr. Draper?" Della asked. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Just being neighborly," he said. "You ever want to talk about selling, you know where to find me." "I don't, actually," Della said, "because I'm not selling. Good day." She turned and walked back toward the house, and she heard Draper say something low to his men and the horses move away down the road. Her hands were shaking slightly, she noticed, when she got to the porch steps. Not from fear, from something more like cold fury. Marshall appeared around the corner of the barn. He had clearly heard some portion of it. He looked at her face and then at the road where the riders had gone. "Draper," he said, "you know him." "Know of him. Met him at Whitmore's store. He bought half the South Range from a family that lost their livestock to bloat 3 years back, paid them about 1/3 of what it was worth. He's been wanting this land since before Thomas died," Della said, "and Greer was helping him get it." Marshall was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said, "he's not getting it." There was no bluster in it, no chest beating. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which he stated all facts. She looked at him standing there in the cold afternoon with sawdust on his shirt and his hands loose at his sides, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular and steadying sensation of not being alone in something. "No," she said. "He's not." December arrived. The debt was paid, the bank note was satisfied, and the land was securely theirs. The first really cold night of the season hit hard from the north, and Della woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of the wind coming under the door, and felt the temperature in the house, and knew immediately that the barn was too cold for a person to be sleeping in it. She got up and put on her coat and walked across the dark yard with a lamp and opened the barn door. Marshall was on the cot in the corner, fully dressed including his coat and boots, covered in the doubled blankets. He was awake, she could see his eyes open in the lamplight. "You'll freeze," she said. He sat up. "I've been cold before," he said, which was what he always said. "Marshall," she said, and his name felt different in her mouth this time, like something she was choosing deliberately. "Come inside." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the lamplit barn with the cold air around them both, the horses shifting in their stalls. "I gave you my word," he said carefully, "that you'd be under no obligation." "I know what you said," she said, "and I'm telling you that I want you to come inside. There's a cold that will hurt a person, and this is it." He came inside. She made up the settee in the front room with the blankets she had in the chest, and he looked at the settee and then at her. "The settee will do fine," he said. "I know it will," she said. She went back to her room and lay down and stared at the ceiling, and she could hear him moving in the front room, the creak of the settee, and she was aware of the particular comfort of knowing there was another heartbeat in the house. She fell asleep faster than she had in weeks. In the morning, she found him already up and the fire already going and coffee made, sitting at the kitchen table with a worn piece of paper and a pencil, working on something that looked like a diagram. "What is that?" she said, coming to look over his shoulder without thinking about it. "The layout of the south field," he said. "Thinking about what we could plant in spring that would come in before the heat gets too bad. Sorghum, probably, and maybe a kitchen garden along the east fence." He pointed at a section of the diagram. "If we redirected this part of the well drainage, we could water it without hauling as much by hand." She looked at the diagram. She looked at the neat, practical lines of it. She looked at his hand holding the pencil, a hand that had rebuilt her fence and fixed her roof and paid her debt without asking for anything she hadn't freely offered. "May I?" she said, and reached for the pencil. He handed it over. She sat down beside him and began to add notations to the diagram. She knew this land, had walked it in every season, and there were things she understood about its particular character that his 6 weeks of experience could not yet have shown him. He watched her with interest, leaning slightly toward her in a way that was probably unconscious, and she was aware of the warmth of him and the smell of pine smoke and leather that had become over these weeks what morning smelled like. "Here," she said, pointing to the section along the east fence. "This ground stays wet late into spring from the snowmelt. If you put in the garden too early, it'll rot before it grows." "I'd have lost a month of work figuring that out," he said. "You would have," she agreed, and she looked up and found him looking at her rather than at the diagram, and for a moment neither of them looked away. Then he looked back at the diagram, and she looked back at the diagram, and both of them examined it with a great deal more attention than was strictly necessary. The Christmas of 1878 was quiet. There was no money for celebration, and neither of them expected any. Della made a simple supper on Christmas Eve, and they sat at the table longer than usual after the meal was done, the lamp turned low, the wind outside finding all the small gaps in the walls that Marshall had not yet had time to address. He had gone into town 2 days before and come back with a small wrapped package that he had set on the kitchen shelf and not mentioned since. She had done the same thing. She had spent 2 days reknitting a pair of wool gloves from some yarn she had unraveled from an old blanket, measuring his hands when he wasn't paying attention, by pretending to examine a blister he had got from the fence work, making them in his size. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged these things across the kitchen table. He gave her 3 books. She did not know how he knew she had sold her books, she had never told him. But somehow he knew, and he had found them at a general store in the next town that had a small lending library, and they were good ones. 2 novels she had not read and a collected poetry volume whose spine she touched with both hands as though it were something living. "How did you know about the books?" she asked. "Hector mentioned it," he said, "that you'd sold them." She looked at the books, she looked at him. She felt the warmth working up from her chest and pressing against the back of her eyes in a way she was not going to allow, not here, not now. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady and she was proud of it. He looked at the gloves she had given him and turned them over in his hands and then looked at her with an expression she did not know how to catalog. "You measured my hands when you were pretending to look at that blister," he said. "I did," she said. He put the gloves on. "They fit perfectly." He looked at his gloved hands for a moment, and when he looked up there was something in his face that was open in a way she had not seen before, something that had come up to the surface and was visible, not hidden. "Della," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something he had been deciding whether to say for a long time. "Marshall," she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the lamplight on Christmas Eve, and the wind moved outside and the house was warm from the stove, and she thought, "I want to know this man. I want to know all of him, in the long, patient way that takes years, and I want those years." "I think," she said carefully, "that the arrangement we made has perhaps shifted somewhat." "I think so too," he said. "I would like to know what you think about that," she said. He was quiet for a moment in his thoughtful way. "I think I haven't been as careful as I meant to be," he said. "About not," he paused. "I meant what I said that first evening. You were under no obligation. I didn't mean for you to feel any pressure." "I don't," she said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. I don't feel pressure. I feel—" She stopped. She looked at the books. She looked at the gloves on his hands. She looked at the diagram of the south field that was still on the table between them. "I feel that something real has happened," she said, "and I would like to stop pretending it hasn't." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "So would I." She reached across the table and set her hand over his gloved ones, and he turned his hand over and held hers with a gentleness that made her understand that he had been wanting to do that for some time. They sat like that for a while, with the lamp between them and the wind outside and the fire in the stove cracking and settling, and it was the most peaceful Della Blackwell Holloway had felt in longer than she could remember. What followed was a courtship inside a marriage, which was something she had not known was possible and found to be, in its own particular way, more lovely than a courtship outside one. They already knew each other's habits and silences. They had already seen the hard parts, the debt, the difficulty, the cold, the bare pantry. What was left was the good parts, and they discovered those slowly, with a pleasure made more acute by the context. She read aloud from her new books in the evenings after supper, while he worked on small repairs by the fire. He was, she discovered, a person who could listen and work simultaneously and retain everything. He had opinions about the books that were thoughtful and unexpected. He had read more than she had assumed, not widely, but carefully, a handful of books read multiple times over the years of his traveling life. He played checkers with a quiet competitive intensity that made her laugh. She was better than he was, and he was honest about this and did not find it diminishing. He was a person who did not ask for things, she noticed. Not just material things, but emotional things, acknowledgement, praise, comfort. He seemed to have arranged himself to need very little, in the way that people do when they have spent a long time with no one to provide it. It made her want to offer it, specifically because he did not ask. One cold January afternoon she came out to find him sitting on the back steps of the house with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, looking out at the plain with an expression she had not seen before. Not troubled exactly, but distant. She sat down beside him without asking, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What is it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My father died broke," he said. "This time of year." January. He always said he was going to turn things around in spring. He ran out of springs. She did not say anything for a moment. She understood that this was not something he said to many people. "You're not him," she said finally. "I know that," he said, "but you worry about it." "I worry about it," he confirmed. "You've done more good work on this property in 2 months than was done on it in 6 years," she said. "And you'll have a crop plan ready for spring and enough money from the eggs and the pig to seed it properly. You are not running out of springs." He turned and looked at her with an expression of such unguarded gratitude that she felt it like a physical thing. "Also," she said, "your father didn't have me." He smiled, that real smile that changed his face, and shook his head slowly, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and he did not move away, and they sat there in the cold January afternoon looking out at their land. That was the evening she moved the settee blankets back to the chest. She came into the front room while he was banking the fire for the night, and she said, quietly, "Marshall." He turned. "I don't want you sleeping on the settee anymore," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that careful, deliberate attention she had come to love. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I have been sure for longer than I'm comfortable admitting," she said. He crossed the room in 2 strides and cupped her face in his calloused hands with a gentleness that made her close her eyes, and when she opened them, he was looking at her with an expression so open and so certain that she understood, looking at it, that whatever he felt for her was not something that had grown gradually from nothing. It had been there from the beginning, waiting with characteristic patience for her to be ready. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and outside the winter wind moved across the plain, and the stars over Harrow Creek were sharp and plentiful and very far away. What followed the cold months was spring arriving like an argument won after a long negotiation. It came in late March with warmth and wind and the smell of wet earth turning, and Marshall was in the south field at first light every morning with the plow, and Della was in the kitchen garden she had mapped out along the east fence, hands in the good dark soil, planting things that would feed them by summer. They worked alongside each other with a companionship that had grown so natural that she sometimes forgot there had been a time before it. Neighbors who had not previously paid the Blackwell property much attention began to come by, partly out of curiosity about the new husband, and partly because word was spreading that the place had changed. Hector Finch brought his son to help with the barn wall for 2 days and left, both times having shared a meal and a long conversation with Marshall that left him looking thoughtful and pleased. A woman named Rose Pryor, whose husband ran the adjacent claim, came over one afternoon with a jar of preserved peaches and stayed for 3 hours. She watched Marshall cross the yard through the kitchen window and turned to Della with a frank and approving expression. "Where did you find him?" she said. "He found himself here," Della said. "I just said yes." She had been thinking about that a great deal. About what it had meant to say yes in that saloon at Dusk with nothing to recommend it but instinct and the evidence of his eyes. She had been the practical one, she had told herself. She needed land security. He needed a property and a base. But she knew now that had not been the whole of it. Something in her had recognized something in him across a bar in a dim and smoky saloon, and she had trusted that recognition even when she had no right to. She was glad she had. In April, a letter arrived that Marshall read twice and then set on the table. Della could see from across the room that his expression had changed. "What is it?" she said. "From a man named Garth Stills," Marshall said. "He drove cattle with me 3 years ago. He's been working a spread up in New Mexico territory, and he says there's good land available up there if I'm looking." Della sat down across from him at the table. "Are you looking?" she asked. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. He looked up at her. "No," he said immediately. "No, I'm not looking. I'm where I want to be." He paused. "I just want you to know that I get these sometimes. Letters from men I've worked with. And that none of them pull at me the way they used to." She looked at him. "What pulls at you instead?" she asked. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "This," he said simply. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his and squeezed once, firmly, and that was that. He wrote back to Garth Stills and wished him well in New Mexico, and the letter was sent and the matter was closed. The spring crop of sorghum went in on schedule and came up strong. The kitchen garden along the east fence grew beans and squash, and a good patch of corn that Marshall tended with the same methodical care he gave to everything. The pig had grown impressively, and was already being discussed in terms of what she might contribute to the household by autumn. The chickens were laying reliably, and Della had built up a regular customer in town who bought the surplus eggs every Saturday. They had built, Della understood, an actual thing. A life, an operating, functional, growing life, out of two strangers in a saloon and a bank note and a leap of faith in the dusk. One evening in late May, she was coming in from the garden with her arms full of early beans when she stopped on the porch step and looked at the yard. Marshall was at the pump, washing his face and hands after the day's work. The last light was going gold and long across the land. The barn door stood open, and she could hear the horses shifting inside. The fence along the road was straight and well kept. The kitchen garden was green and regular along the east fence. The house behind her was warm and dry, no bucket in the bedroom corner. She looked at it all and felt something she could only call fullness. Not happiness exactly, though that was part of it. More like the completion of something that had been waiting to be finished for a long time. Marshall looked up from the pump and saw her standing there, and even from across the yard she could see him smile. Beans. He said, "A lot of them," she said. "Get washed up, I'll make supper." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the warmth in his voice was so casual and natural that it reached her from 30 feet away. In June, Della discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 4 days before she told him, not because she doubted his reaction but because she wanted a few days of carrying it privately, this strange and wonderful and frightening thing, before it became shared. She had not thought children were in her future. She and Thomas had been married 6 years without them, and she had quietly made her peace with that somewhere along the way. Now she sat with the changed reality of it and felt something she had not expected, which was a specific and tender joy. She told him on a Friday evening after supper, while they were sitting on the back steps watching the sun go down. She said simply, "I think we're going to have a child." He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Something enormous moved across his face, surprise, and then a softness so complete it transformed him, made him look for a moment like the 19-year-old who had left this country with $30 and his whole life ahead of him. "Della," he said. "Probably February," she said, "if my calculation is right." He put his arm around her, slowly and carefully, as though she had become newly fragile, which she found she both wanted to correct him about and didn't want to correct him about at the same time. She leaned into him. The sun was going down in long copper strips across the flat horizon, and the air smelled like warm grass and the distant possibility of rain. "Are you all right?" he asked. How are you feeling?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm very well, actually." He held her closer, and she could feel the depth of his breathing, the steadiness of him, and she thought, this is it. This is what she had been unable to name when she walked into the Copper Nail on that cold November evening. She had recognized something in him that her own deeper self had known she needed, even when her practical mind was only calculating the numbers of a debt. "We're going to need to add a room," he said eventually, his chin resting on top of her head. She laughed and felt him smile against her hair. "You and your diagrams," she said. "You love the diagrams," he said. "I love the diagrams," she confirmed. The summer was busy and good. Marshall, with the help of Hector's son Eli, began framing the addition to the back of the house. A proper second room that would serve as a bedroom for the child, and eventually, perhaps, children. Della managed the kitchen garden through the July heat with a particular stubbornness that Marshall watched with evident admiration and occasional gentle argument about whether she was overdoing it. "I'm fine," she would say. "You are fine," he would agree, "and you should still sit down for an hour." "You are fussing," she would say. "I am absolutely fussing," he would confirm, "and you can sit down while I do it." Cole Draper came by once more in August, this time without his riders. He came to the gate, and she came out to meet him, Marshall appearing behind her so naturally that it didn't look staged. Draper looked at the added room going up on the back of the house, at the thriving sorghum field, at the well-maintained yard, and something in his assessment shifted into resignation. He was a practical man under the ambition, she understood, and he could see that this property was no longer going to become available. Heard congratulations might be in order, he said, about the family addition. Word traveled fast in small towns. Della was not surprised. Thank you, she said. Draper nodded. He nodded to Marshall. Something passed between the two men that was not exactly friendliness, but was the acknowledgement of a boundary clearly established. Then Draper rode away, and Della suspected he would not come back. Is he going to be a problem? Marshall asked. Not anymore, she said. He was never a bad man, just an ambitious one who saw an opportunity. She paused. He's out of opportunities. Autumn came in rich and gold. The sorghum harvest was not large. It was their first season, and the land had needed work before it was productive, but it was solid, and the money from it, combined with the egg sales and the sale of 2 hogs that the pig's unexpected companion had produced, gave them the most financially stable month since Marshall's arrival. They paid Whitmore's credit extension in full, and Whitmore wrote the receipt with a pleased efficiency that told her he had not been entirely certain they could do it. The room addition was finished by October, and Della stood in it and looked at the clean pine walls and the window Marshall had set to face east so the morning light would come in, and she thought about the February baby and the cot they would put in the corner, and the way this small square of new wood was going to change the shape of their life. She put her hand against the pine wall and felt its solidity. "What do you think?" Marshall said from the doorway. "I think you built something good," she said. "We built something good," he said. She turned and looked at him leaning in the doorway of the room he had built with his own hands, in the house they were building a life in on the land that was theirs, and she felt the fullness again, that complete and settled thing, and she crossed to him and put her hands against his chest and looked up at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said, putting his hands over hers. "When I walked into that saloon," she said, "I told myself I was being practical, that it was a business arrangement, that I was assessing a proposition clearly and without sentiment." "I remember," he said. "I was lying to myself," she said. "Or not lying, but not seeing clearly. From the very beginning there was something else. I just didn't have permission to acknowledge it." He looked at her with that open, honest expression that was the most consistently reliable face she knew. "I know," he said quietly. "I felt it too. I thought you needed time to come to it yourself." "I did," she said, "but I've come to it completely." He bent his head and kissed her, and she held onto the front of his shirt and kissed him back. And the October light came through the new east-facing window and lay in long golden squares on the pine floor. November arrived, and with it the first anniversary of the evening she had walked into the Copper Nail. Della thought about that evening with a kind of affectionate incredulity, the cold dusk, her cold hands around a coffee cup, the stranger on the bar stool who had looked at her as if she were a person worth reckoning with. She told him about it at supper. "1 year ago today," she said, "approximately." He looked up from his plate. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it." "What were you thinking?" He set down his fork and looked at her across the table in the lamplight. "That it's the best decision I ever made," he said. "Sitting in that saloon and hoping someone would walk through the door." "You didn't hope I'd walk through the door," she said. "You didn't know I existed." "I hoped something would walk through the door," he said. "I just didn't know what it was yet." She looked at him. She thought about the debt and the desperation and the cold November dusk and the stranger's eyes in the lamplight. She thought about the way that one thing, one yes, one decision made in the face of everything against it, had changed the entire shape of what her life was. "I'm glad I was early," she said. He smiled. "So am I." She reached across and picked up his hand and held it, and outside the November wind moved over the plain with the familiar particular sound that she had learned to love over 6 years of living in this country, and the lamp burned steadily between them, and the baby moved inside her for the first time, a faint, astonishing flutter, and she sat very still for a moment. "Marshall," she said. He saw her expression and was immediately still. "What? Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly all right," she said. "Give me your hand." She put his hand against the side of her abdomen and waited, nothing for a moment. Then the flutter again, small and definite and real. He went completely still. Something moved through his face that she could not describe, had no words adequate to describe something enormous and quiet and irreversible. "Oh," he said, very softly. They sat like that for a long moment in the lamplight of their kitchen, his hand warm against her, the world outside doing what it always did, and inside the house everything that mattered in all the world was right here, at this table in this moment. The winter of late 1879 settled over Harrow Creek, with a particular ferocity that old Hector Finch said he had not seen in a decade. The snow came in December and stayed, and the temperature dropped in the nights to the kind of cold that made the wood of the walls crack and speak. Marshall kept the fire going around the clock and insisted that Della stay close to it as January approached, and she allowed this without complaint because she was, herself, tired in a way that sat in her bones and would not be argued with. She spent those long cold days doing small useful things, mending, keeping the stove, writing letters to a sister in Missouri she had not corresponded with properly in years. The sister's name was Clara, and she had written back with a warmth that Della found she had been missing without knowing she had been missing it. She told Clara about Marshall in a long letter that she wrote over the course of 3 evenings, and when she read it back, she found that the portrait she had painted of him was so thorough and so admiring that she laughed at herself. She showed the letter to Marshall before she sent it, and he read it with an expression of careful embarrassment. "It's very kind," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "Don't be modest about accurate." He handed it back. "Send it," he said. Clara wrote back that she hoped to come visit in summer, and Della read this letter twice with a pleasure so uncomplicated that it surprised her. The baby came in February, as she had calculated, on a Tuesday evening when Marshall had spent the entire previous night awake worrying about a ewe they had recently acquired who was having a difficult labor. The ewe had been fine. Della had watched him come in from the barn at dawn, exhausted and relieved, and had said, "Sit down and eat something." And he had sat down and eaten something and then looked at her and said, "How are you feeling this morning?" And she had said with a certain precision, like something is happening. Bess came, and the local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Crane who had been delivering babies in Harrow Creek for 15 years, and Marshall was relegated to the front room where he stood and then paced and then sat and then stood again with a thoroughness that Bess found entertaining. At 8 in the evening, Mrs. Crane opened the bedroom door and looked at him with the composed expression of a woman who had done this many times. "A son," she said. "Mother and baby are well." Marshall sat down on the settee because his legs appeared to have made a decision without his consultation. "A son," he said. "A fine big one," Mrs. Crane said. "Come in and see." He came in and saw. Della was sitting up against the pillow with the baby in her arms, and she looked tired in the way of someone who has done something enormous and is now at rest, and she looked up when he came to the edge of the bed, and her face did something he would carry in him for the rest of his days. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby. The baby had Della's dark eyes and a head of dark hair and a face that had the particular concentrated seriousness of all very new people. "Hello," Marshall said to the baby very quietly, feeling somewhat ridiculous and not caring. The baby blinked. A fist waved with vague majesty. "We should name him," Della said. They had discussed this. They had no one name that had emerged as clearly right, and now, looking at the actual person rather than the theoretical one, it was different. "James," Marshall said. He had not intended to say it. It came out. "After my father. Not because he was anything I'd hold up as a model, but because he tried and he had some good in him before the trying wore him out, and I think I'd like to give him the name again and let it mean something better this time." Della looked at him. She looked at the baby. "James Holloway," she said, trying it. "James Marshall Holloway," Marshall said, "if you think that's too much." "I think it's exactly right," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they looked at James Marshall Holloway, who was examining the ceiling with the same thorough, methodical attention that his father gave to new information. And Della felt the fullness again, so complete now that it pressed outward from her chest in all directions, reaching past the walls of the house, across the land, up into the cold February sky that was dark and clear and full of stars. The spring that followed was the truest spring Della had ever experienced, and she had seen 28 of them. James was an alert and sturdy baby who from the beginning seemed to share his father's quality of patient attention, sitting propped against whatever surface was available and watching the world with those dark eyes, turning his head to follow Marshall's voice when he came in from the fields. Marshall was, and this was something Della observed with a love so large she sometimes had to walk outside and stand in the yard with it for a moment, a father of extraordinary natural gentleness. He had not known, she suspected, that he had this in him. He had lived alone for so long, needing so little, expecting so little, that the opening of this particular capacity seemed to surprise him as much as it moved her. He would come in from the fields and wash his hands and come to wherever James was and spend time just talking to him, low and unhurried, narrating the day, explaining the sorghum's progress or the state of the fence line or what the weather was doing, as though James understood every word and was entitled to a full accounting. James appeared to find this arrangement entirely satisfactory. "He can't understand you," Della said once, though she said it with a smile. "He'll understand eventually," Marshall said. Better to start now. That summer Clara came from Missouri. She arrived on the stage from San Antonio, a smaller and brighter version of Della with quick brown eyes and an immediate and comprehensive assessment of the situation that she delivered to Della privately on her first evening. "He's in love with you," Clara said, with the directness of a younger sister who had waited years to weigh in on her siblings' marital circumstances. "I know," Della said. "Are you in love with him?" "Completely," Della said. Clara looked satisfied. "Good. I was afraid that letter was you putting the best face on a difficult situation, but it wasn't." "No," Della said, "it wasn't." Clara stayed for 3 weeks, and in that time inserted herself into the life of the household, with such natural ease that Marshall admitted to Della privately that he had not realized how much he had wanted siblings until he had a sample of the experience. Clara brought them news from Missouri and conversation and laughter, and an ability to hold James for extended periods while Della did other things, which was a gift of immeasurable practical value. On the evening before Clara left, she sat at the kitchen table with Marshall after supper while Della put James down, and they talked. She told Della about it afterward, about what Della had been like growing up. The book-reading girl who could not be stopped, the one who had opinions about everything and was always the last one argued into silence and the first one back with a stronger point. "She's that way still," Marshall said. "I know," Clara said. "You like it." "I love it," he said, simply and without self-consciousness, and Clara filed this information away and reported it to Della the next morning with the air of someone handing over something precious. Della heard it and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He told me directly, you know. He doesn't need to say it in corners." "I know," Clara said. "I just wanted to hear it when he didn't know I was going to tell you." The trial of the autumn, because there was always a trial. The frontier was not interested in unbroken ease, came in October. It was Aldous Greer, and a thing he had been arranging quietly for some months. He had sold a portion of the debt paper old paper, prior to settlement, to a man in Laredo who was in the business of finding technical grounds on which settled debts could be reopened. It was the kind of legal maneuvering that preyed on people who did not have money for lawyers. And it was, Della learned from Hector Finch, who had heard it from the barber who had heard it from Greer's own clerk, aimed specifically at the Holloway property. She told Marshall about it at breakfast on a Thursday morning in October, laying it out plainly, and he listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was finished, he said, "We need a lawyer." Lawyers cost money, she said. We have money, he said. Not much, but enough for this. They went to San Antonio, which was the nearest place to find a lawyer who practiced in property law, and they found one named Augustus Vail, a dry and sharp man of 50 who wore a good suit, and had the eyes of someone who had seen most of what the law could be used for and disapproved of approximately half of it. He looked at their documents, including the original settlement receipt, for a long time. "This is a thin argument Greer is making," Vail said. "Thin enough that I think he knows it won't hold. He's hoping you'll settle for a reduced payment rather than pay legal fees." "Then we don't settle," Della said. Vail looked at her. "It will cost approximately what he's hoping you'll pay him," he said. "Then we pay it to you instead," she said. "And we come out of it with nothing owed and nothing hanging over us, rather than paying him and giving him the satisfaction of having extracted something." Vail looked at Marshall. Marshall looked at Della. "She's right," Marshall said. Vail allowed himself something that was almost a smile. "Yes," he said, "she is." Vail sent a letter to Greer laying out, with considerable legal precision, the lack of merit in the proposed claim, and Greer's response, which came back within a week, was a complete withdrawal. It cost them what they had put aside for the second year's expanded sorghum planting, and they came home from San Antonio on a late October evening with the case settled, and the account closed and considerably less money than they'd left with. And Della sat on the buckboard next to Marshall on the ride home and leaned against him under the cold stars. "We'll manage the planting another way," she said. "We'll manage," he agreed. She felt him press a kiss to the top of her head, brief and warm. "I want him out of our lives," she said. "Greer, I want to never have to think about him again." "He's done," Marshall said. "He knows he overreached and he won't do it again. He doesn't have a legal leg to stand on, and Vail made sure he knew it." She breathed out. "Good," she said. The matter closed like a book, and she did not think of Aldous Greer again with any particular intensity for the rest of her life. Christmas of 1879 was different from the previous year in almost every way that mattered. There was food enough for a proper feast: roast pork, and preserved vegetables from the garden, and a pie that Bess brought over as a gift. James, who was 10 months old and had discovered that the world was full of things worth grabbing, sat on a quilt near the stove and grabbed things with the focused determination of a person with important work to do. Hector Finch and his son Eli came for supper. Rose and Thomas Pryor came from next door. Bess and Cully. Clara had sent gifts from Missouri, including a book for Della and a set of small wooden animals for James, carved by someone in Laurel who made such things. Marshall sat at the head of the table he had built. They had replaced the old kitchen table in November with one he had constructed himself from good pine, wider and sturdier, and looked around at the room full of people and food and lamplight. And Della, watching him from the other end of the table, saw something on his face that she recognized, because she had felt its equivalent so many times in the past year. She lifted her glass toward him. He caught it and lifted his in return, and in the noise and warmth of the room it was a small private thing that no one else saw, just between the two of them, the specific language they had developed over a year of building a life together. The new year came and the land turned around to spring again, and with spring came growth. The sorghum fields expanded. The kitchen garden was planned larger. James took his first steps in April, straight toward the barn door, as though he knew exactly where he was going, and Marshall was there to catch him when he tipped forward at the third step, and Della was watching from the yard with her hand over her mouth and tears on her face that she did not bother to wipe away. In May of 1880, Della learned she was pregnant again. This time she told Marshall the same evening, sitting on the back steps in the dusk with James asleep inside and the spring air soft around them. He turned to her slowly. "Again," he said, and his tone was so full of uncomplicated happiness that she laughed. "Again," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the land around them was dark and sweet and alive with the sound of insects and the distant low of cattle from Pryor's field, and the sky sat low and wide above them, paying attention just as he had said it did. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm very glad." "So am I," she said. James had a sister in November, Eleanor Rose Holloway, who arrived in the world with a decisive set of lungs and a head of copper-red hair that bore no obvious relation to either parent, and yet looked entirely right on her. Mrs. Crane delivered her with efficient competence, and Marshall sat in the front room for the second time with considerably more practiced anxiety, having learned from the first time that anxiety was his inevitable contribution to the process, and there was no eliminating it, only enduring it. When it was over and Mrs. Crane opened the door again and said, "A daughter," he put his head in his hands for a moment, and Bess, who was there again, patted his back and said, "They're both perfectly well," and he looked up with an expression so raw and grateful that Bess told Cully about it later that evening with unwanted sentimentality. Della was sitting up in the lamplight with Eleanor, who was already examining the room with the suspicious assessment of someone who has arrived somewhere and is not certain the accommodations are adequate, and when Marshall came through the door she looked up at him and smiled in a way that he felt down to the roots of himself. "She's healthy," Della said, "and loud." "I heard," he said. He sat beside them and looked at Eleanor, who looked back at him with the dark blue eyes that all very new babies have and that would, in her case, settle eventually into her mother's clear dark brown. "Hello, Eleanor," he said. Eleanor appeared to be reserving judgment. James, who had been managed through the evening by Bess and was now in the doorway in his nightshirt looking at the new situation, said "Bah," which was his current comprehensive assessment of most things. "Come here," Marshall said, and lifted James and settled him on his knee, and the four of them were in the lamplight together, the family that had been built from a Dusk and a saloon and a yes. The years that followed were the years of building, not just the practical building, though there was always that, a new fence section, an improved water line from the well, a chicken house expansion that doubled their egg production, a proper root cellar dug in the fall of 1881 that changed the entire character of their winter provisions. But the other building, the interior kind, the kind that happens when people who have chosen each other deliberately and clearly continue to choose each other every day. Marshall was, in all the ways that Della had most needed and least expected to find, a partner in the fullest sense of the word. He argued with her when he thought she was wrong, not often, but when he did it was direct and honest, and she respected it more than agreement would have been. He asked her opinion on things that other men in Harrow Creek did not ask their wives about. The business decisions, the planting plans, whether to take the offer that came from a cattle operator in 1882 to run some head on their South Range for a season, whether to lend money to the Pryor family when Thomas Pryor broke his leg and the spring planting was at risk. He did not ask her opinion as performance. He asked because he wanted to know what she thought, and she had spent the first 2 years of their marriage waiting for this to stop and finding that it did not. She taught him things about the land he hadn't known, and he taught her things about animals she hadn't understood, and together they produced a particular competence that was better than either of them had separately, and both of them knew it. Harrow Creek changed around them in the way frontier towns change, quickly and then slowly. The first rush of cattle trade-era wealth building saloons and banks, and then the gradual settling into something more permanent. The school built in 1881, the church with its actual bell in 1882, the doctor who came in 1883 and stayed because enough people needed him to stay. The town had been a rough place when Della arrived in 1872, and by 1883 it was beginning to look like something more settled, more deliberate, more like a place where people were choosing to live rather than simply finding themselves. The Holloway property was unrecognizable from the two-room house, with the leaking roof that had been mortgaged to its limit in 1878. Marshall had extended it to 4 rooms, proper rooms with proper walls, and the barn had been rebuilt almost entirely from its original structure. The south field ran sorghum every other year in rotation with winter wheat, and the kitchen garden had become the kitchen and market garden, producing a surplus that Della sold in town with the same quiet, unflinching efficiency with which she had once sold Thomas's rocking chair and her own books. The difference being that she sold the surplus from abundance rather than from desperation, and she felt the difference in her bones every single time. In the spring of 1884, James was 4 and Alina was 3, and the household was in the organized chaos of 2 small children, livestock, a full farming season, and Della's growing market garden business. And it was in the midst of all of this that Marshall came in one afternoon and said, with the casual precision that was his way of delivering important things, "I've been thinking about the north pasture." She was seating starter trays at the kitchen table. "What about it?" He sat down across from her and pulled out the worn, creased diagram that lived in his shirt pocket. There was always a diagram, and spread it on the table. "If we put up proper fencing and brought in a small cattle herd, we could run 8 to 10 head on that ground without overworking it." She looked at the diagram. She looked at the numbers he had written alongside it, his familiar, neat, practical hand. She thought about the capital required. "We could do it," she said slowly. "We'd need to pull from the garden account and the sorghum reserve." "I know," he said. "It would be tight for a season." She looked at the diagram again. She thought about it with the clear, unsentimental assessment she had developed for this kind of decision, the assessment that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with what was actually in front of them. "Yes," she said, "let's do it." He looked up at her, the small smile. "You didn't even hesitate." "I hesitated internally," she said. "For about 4 seconds." She picked up her seed packet. "Make a real plan and we'll go to Whitmore together." By summer of 1884, 10 head of cattle were grazing the north pasture, and Della Blackwell Holloway was standing at the fence line in the evening light watching them, with a feeling she had no adequate language for. She heard Marshall come up behind her and felt his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him. "You all right?" he said near her ear. "I was thinking about that first evening," she said. "Standing at my fence line and watching the sun go down. I had nothing. I mean that literally nothing in my pantry, nothing in the bank, 22 days until someone else owned this land." He was quiet, his arms around her. "And now I have everything," she said. "I have more than I ever let myself want because wanting too much seemed dangerous." He pressed his lips against her hair. "You had yourself," he said. "Even then, you walked into that saloon by yourself. You said yes on your own terms. You kept everything that was yours." She turned around to face him. He was looking at her with that steady, open expression, the one that had never changed in 6 years of knowing him, the one that made her feel seen in the specific and particular way that she had almost given up hoping to be seen. "You helped," she said. "A little," he said. "More than a little," she said. "Marshall, do you know how?" She stopped. She looked at him. At the face that was as familiar to her now as her own, the jaw that had grown the first threads of gray that he refused to acknowledge, the hazel eyes in the late golden light. "Do you know how fortunate I think we are?" "Every day," he said simply. She put her hands on the sides of his face, this man who had sat alone in a saloon with a single whiskey and hoped for something. And she kissed him, there at the fence line with the cattle in the north pasture, and the sorghum in the south field and their children asleep in the house behind them, with the wide Texas sky sitting low and attentive above everything. He held her close, and she held him, and the evening settled into that particular gold and quiet that she had come to think of as the truest version of the land she lived on, the version that showed you what it really was under all the difficulty. In the years that followed, the Holloway farm continued to grow and change in the ways that good things do when they are tended carefully and honestly. James and Alina grew up on that land with the particular confidence of children who are genuinely known by their parents, who can see clearly what steady work and honest partnership looks like, and who carry that understanding into the world with them like a piece of the flat Texas sky in their chests. There was a third child, a boy they named Thomas, not after Thomas Blackwell specifically, but because Della had thought, in the quiet way she thought about such things, that the name deserved to be carried forward into something better than what she had known it to be. Thomas Holloway arrived in 1886 and was, from his first breath, his mother's son, opinionated, alert, and convinced of his own rightness in a way that Marshall watched with unconcealed delight. "He's going to give you trouble," Marshall said. "He's going to give everyone trouble," Della said, watching the baby wave his fists at the ceiling. "I can manage." "I know you can," he said. Aldous Greer left Harrow Creek in 1885. No one was quite sure where, and was replaced at the bank by a younger man who shook hands with farmers and meant it. Cole Draper sold his operation to a syndicate from Dallas in 1886 and retired somewhere east. The sheriff, who had preferred card tables, was replaced by a younger man who took the job seriously. The town continued to become something more deliberate, and the Holloways were part of that becoming, known as steady and trustworthy people, which was exactly what they were. Clara visited again in the summer of 1886, and this time she brought her own husband, a schoolteacher from Laurel named George, who was calm and bookish and regarded Marshall with immediate approval. They sat on the porch in the summer evenings and talked about books and farming and the state of the territory, and the children ran in the yard below them, and the stars came out over the flat land one by one, and it was the kind of evening that stays with a person. Della and Clara sat together late on the last night of the visit while the men were checking on the livestock, and the children were asleep. "You look different from when I last came," Clara said. "It's been 7 years since you first visited," Della said. "People change in 7 years." "It's not age," Clara said. "It's settled. You look settled all the way through." Della thought about this. It was accurate. There had been something unsettled in her for a long time, the quiet emergency of making it through the next day, the next month, the next year. The constant low-level vigilance of someone who was never quite sure the ground was solid. She had not known how exhausting it was until it was not there anymore. "I am," she said, "settled all the way through." "He did that," Clara said, not critically but observationally. "We did it," Della said, "together." Clara nodded, satisfied with this precision. When the men came back from the barn, Marshall met Della's eyes across the porch in the lamplight, and she met his. And in that brief exchange passed something that had no language and required none: the specific and certain recognition of two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built, from that unlikely beginning, something true and lasting and deeply theirs. The autumn of 1888, 10 years after the Dusk at the Copper Nail, Della stood again at her fence line in the evening. The children were inside. Marshall was finishing something in the barn. She could hear the familiar sound of tools. The land around her was a version of itself she had watched change season by season, year by year. The flat hardpan of 6 years of modest and struggling farming transformed now into something that had shape and intention in it. The fields organized and purposeful. The north pasture with its good cattle herd. The chicken house and the hog operation, and the full, green kitchen garden whose season had just ended, and whose soil was ready to be put to winter rest. The sky was the colors she had come to love most, the deep copper and violet of a Texas autumn dusk, the last line of it burning low at the horizon before the blue dark came in overhead. The barn door opened and Marshall walked across the yard, his tools in one hand, the other hand swinging loose, and he saw her at the fence and changed direction without breaking stride and came to stand beside her. For a moment they just looked at the evening together, this man and this woman who had chosen each other in the most improbable of circumstances and had been choosing each other ever since, every day in every small and large decision, every morning and every evening. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. What do you think, she said, when you look back at that evening, the saloon, the proposal? He was quiet for a moment in his characteristic way, considering the question properly before answering it. I think I was braver than I knew, he said, and you were braver than I knew, and that both of those were necessary. She looked at him. He looked at her. The sky above them was paying attention, just as he had said it did all those years ago, that first morning over a diagram and a shared cup of coffee. "I want to tell you something," she said, "that I don't think I've said clearly enough." "All right," he said. "I love you," she said. "Not because of the debt, not because of the land, not because of James and Eleanor and Thomas. All of that is part of it, but it's not the root of it. The root of it is you, the specific, particular, irreplaceable person that you are. I want you to know that I know the difference." He turned to face her fully. He looked at her with those clear hazel eyes in the dusk light, and she could see that she had gotten to him, which she had intended and which she would never grow tired of being able to do. "I know," he said. "Then, I love you, the same way. The root of it is you." She reached up and touched his face, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood at the fence line of their land in the last light of the October day, with everything they had built around them, and everything that mattered to them inside the house at their backs, and there was nowhere else in the world that either of them would have been. The wind came off the plain and moved through the dry grass with a sound she had learned to read like language, and the first stars appeared at the edge of the violet sky, and the day settled into the good dark of a frontier evening, with the lamp in the kitchen window making a warm square of light that was visible from the fence line, visible from the road, visible like a thing that was meant to be seen. A house that was a home, a farm that was a life. Two people who had found each other at the edge of everything, and made something from nothing that was solid and true and would last. She took his hand and they walked back across the yard toward the warm light. And inside the house their children were waiting, and the stove was going, and the evening was beginning, and everything was exactly as it should be.